So part of an ongoing civil war in religious terms, and this goes far beyond Christianity, is sort of the mystical versus the applied. I'll use those terms. I've been reading a history of the Jews, and in the medieval period, there was a very interesting debate about, which is preferred, to just study Torah all the time or to have it applied. And the debate goes fierce. And in many ways, they said, well, studying Torah is the highest thing that you can do, unless, of course, some widow is outside your door. And if you turn away the widow because you're studying Torah, well, you have failed the law, and rightfully so, because by its very nature, law attempts to use the propositional to create a much more procedural, but then potentially perspectival and participatory reality. Reality is always more than the propositional, and I think John nicely lays that out here. So back to the reflections on the Sermon on the Mount. So in the medieval period, this is history of interpretation, which always fascinates me. In the medieval period, there's sort of the sermon was often read sort of with a two-speed. So the mystics will read the sermon and the mystics and the ascetics will read the sermon in a particular way, but regular people living in the village can't live that out. The Protestant Reformation very much seeks to have the whole community live it out, but then Luther, in a sense, uses it as this is a guide to our sinfulness, and you can hear this in sermons beyond Lutheranism. Of course, Calvin brings in the third use of the law, where the law is a guide to grateful living. You can often hear misery, deliverance, gratitudes in my rough draft for Sunday. Anabaptists very much stressed sort of a physicalist, procedural application of the New Testament. If the magisterial Protestants had a predilection, sometimes to their gain, sometimes to their detriment, for, let's say, I'm really trying to not use the word literal because the word is just so deeply conflicted. But if the Protestants tended to lean on propositional belief and assent, Anabaptists tended to lean on very biblicistic procedural knowledge, and that's sort of where the Anabaptist tradition went. Protestant liberals have seen the sermon as a paradigm for the social gospel and a call to the church to usher in the kingdom of God on earth, a view also adopted in a secular form by Karl Marx. Existentialists, and you see us sort of peeling back the time now. Protestant liberalism, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Existentialists, really coming to their own in the middle of the 20th century as the Holocaust sort of rips apart so many of the religious projects of Christianity and Judaism. Existentialists have rejected taking any of the sermon's ethics as absolute, but view it rather as a profound challenge to personal decisions to live in the consciousness of human finitude and divine encounter. Albert Schweitzer's interim ethic also relativized the sermon by finding it a unique urgency that remained as long as the first disciples, like Jesus, mistakenly believed that they would return in their lifetime. And in the Gifford lectures, Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, does a nice job in addressing that issue that cropped up in the last couple of centuries. Dispensationalism has classically limited the sermon's ethic to a future millennial kingdom which Jesus offered to the Jews, by which they rejected, so that it was postponed until his second coming. All of these approaches contain an element of truth, but none of them seems fully satisfactory. Nothing in the sermon suggests that Jesus' commands are limited only to a certain group of his followers. They are in fact expressly addressed to all disciples. Those who have already repented are seeking further instruction. Those who have already repented and are seeking further instruction. Commands for disciples are not self-evidently limited to personal relationships, nor clearly applicable to governments. Questions for pacifism versus just war and the extent of the church-state interaction are legitimate, but not directly addressed. Nor does anything in the sermon suggest that Jesus' commands here are more or less absolute than any of the rest of his ethics, or the teachings be restricted either to present norms or future possibilities. The type of society requiring commands against murder, adultery, divorce, and so on can hardly be described as millennial, but that does not mean that Jesus' vision is fully realizable in this age. Finally, it is impossible to separate Jesus' ethic from allegiance to his person, as Marx and Gandhi tried, or to find any consistent form of application if one follows pure existentialism. And then Bloomberg opts for, which would probably be my favorite, inaugurated eschatology. Seems most in keeping with Jesus' teaching on the kingdom more generally. Inaugurated eschatology recognizes an already not yet tension in which the sermon's ethics remain the ideal or goal of all Christians in every age, but which will never fully be realized until the consummation of the kingdom at Christ's return. We can expect the Spirit to empower us to make substantial strides in obedience, even as we recognize that our sinfulness will prevent us from ever coming close to attaining God's standards. So that's Bloomberg. Now, the Sermon on the Mount opens with the Beatitudes, and so much of what I've seen in my ministry, I've often watched Christians sort of use these for devotions, read them for church devotions, let's say council devotions, because they're so striking. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you look at, let's see, did I keep the search up here? If you look at, these are Beatitudes. It's a particular type of speech, and you can find them in the Psalms. There's a good many of them in the Psalms. You can find them in Proverbs. You can find a few littered in the prophets. And then you can find a lot of them in the Apocrypha, which again is mostly wisdom literature. And as I'll go into the rough draft, which I won't go into now, the fact that Beatitudes are so well known and so expected really makes what I think the Beatitudes and how Jesus uses them at the beginning of his sermon as Aporia. Now, the best. I don't want to say bad things about I think all of my homiletics professors are dead now, so I'll risk it. I'll say this: the class from seminary that I have used most for guiding how I prepare sermons was my class on Christian education with Mary and Spud Snapper. And those of you who are within the CRC, my grin when you think of Snapper. Snapper was an interesting faculty member at Calvin Seminary back in the day because, unlike just about all the rest of Calvin Seminary's faculty, he was not an ordained minister. He was a school teacher, and he was a master school teacher, and he taught elementary school. He was also he created Sunday school curriculum, and so he was there as the professor of church education at the seminary, and he was just a fun, strange, funny guy. He was a master teacher, and his classes were so fun. And one of the key things that he always taught us in terms of lesson planning, and I've always used it in terms of sermon planning, was raise dissonance. And aporia is basically dissonance raising. And so when I look at the Beatitudes and how Jesus breaks, and in fact, where he goes there in the sermon from there, I mean, first he said, there's so much aporia in the Sermon on the Mount, and I think that's part of the reason the church has struggled with it because it's part of what Jesus does. He's just so completely unsettling to people at such a deep level, whereas he's both affirming the Hebrew scriptures and turning them over. In verse 17, do not think I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. It's now dikaiosune, righteousness. I very much recommend Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy to get a sense of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Dallas Willard taught. He had a PhD in phenomenology. He taught at University of Southern California. Died not too many years ago. Tremendous impact. In many ways, this meaning crisis. He talked about it without using those words, at least in Christian evangelical circles. But then Jesus goes on to say things like, you have heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. Well, that's in the 10 Commandments, Jesus. But I tell you, and it's like, Jesus, are you really going to edit the 10 Commandments? I mean, this is the kind of thing that got Jesus killed. And anyone who reads this and has an understanding of the kind of debates that were going on in his time and place should clearly understand why it's really amazing he lasted 3 years doing this. Now, as it happens, I'm always working on my sermon stuff and my local church stuff while I'm also doing all this YouTube stuff. And so when I was this week just reflecting on the Sermon on the Mount, of course, I also had just released that video that I'd done on episode 3 of John's project after Socrates. And once I really sort of got my mind around Aporia as John laid it out, I could really see how Jesus uses that, especially in the Beatitudes. Because just do a little concordance search. That, similar to what, let's see if I can, just do a little concordance search for blessed is if you have your Bible on a computer or a cell phone, and you just read all of those Beatitudes in the Psalms. They're all everything you would expect from a religious book. And then when you read Jesus' Beatitudes, they're just stark. They're not irreverent, because truth be told, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed is the meek, the one that, blessed are the meek, the one that Jordan Peterson has, sort of elevated. That's not breaking the wisdom teaching it's not breaking the Old Testament, but it's sort of taking it and putting it in a frame that I remember seeing. There used to be a website called Hollywood Jesus, where he would sort of go through films and look at symbolism. The symbolism thing's been around a while, folks, but look at symbolism. And I remember he had a really good write-up on the Moulin Rouge. I love that film. It's a great film. It's a great film about love. And he had this write-up about Moulin Rouge, and he talked about how red and blue, when you put red and blue together, it does something to us because your eyes can't quite figure it out. And that's exactly what Jesus does. And so for 2,000 years, scholars have been racking their head against this. And then when I listened to John talk about Aporia, things really clicked.
But let's just right, orientation is this combination of, right, assuming the right agent-arena relationship, the right perspectival knowing, so that I can find my way. So
now again, one of the things that I have that has always lived with me ever since my college days when I started trying to make Christianity my own was the rather obvious reality that mere profession of faith is insufficient. Now, I don't in any way want to dismiss profession of faith, but Jesus says it all the time. Lord, Lord, people will cry out to me. We've done miracles. We've done all these things. Why, depart from me, I've never known you. Jesus says, those who love me keep my commandments. So the Bible has never simply said that, in Protestant circles, sometimes it's called easy believism, where, well, if you just assent mentally, the book of James goes at this really hard and says, the devils believe all these things to be true. That's propositional belief, but they shudder. So, the Bible definitely does not endorse easy believism. And there was the big fight in evangelicalism, oh boy, I'm getting old, 40, 50 years ago. It was sort of this discipleship battle, and whole ranges of new curriculum went through the church. In fact, just yesterday I met with some people locally, and they're the woman of that couple, she's part of the Navigators, and Navigators are this evangelical movement where they help do discipleship. And there's a pastor of a CRC church in Port St. Lucie, Florida. It's become a mega church basically because the pastor has really practiced a discipleship model. He would meet with someone, and he'd, like in the second meeting, he'd say, okay, you get 2 meetings, and after that, the only way that I'm going to continue to meet with you is if, in fact, you make a disciple. You have someone who is willing to be discipled by you, and as I disciple you, you will disciple them. And what he did in this church is create an entire string of people who were not just listening to sermons on Sunday, not just doing daily devotions, but were really digging into their discipleship and getting real with the pastor, and in some ways similar to, let's say, a recovery group. And so all of this to say that real Christianity is always engaging all 4 Ps. All right? That's the goal here, because we are not, as Jamie Smith would say, we are not heads on a stick. We are fully embodied, and so real Christianity engages all 4 Ps.
Orientation is deep, it's primordial. It's presupposed in everything we're doing. When you come into a place, before you start to do anything, you have to properly orient to it. Ratio religio, you have to properly orient. Okay. So he proposes that dialectic brings about this reorientation by exposing us to what he calls radical aporia. Now, many people have noted, and it's part of the way Socrates is monstrous, that Socrates generates aporia in people. What does aporia mean? Well, it means, the original meaning is something like, I've lost my way, I don't know how to go forward, I'm stuck. I'm like, it's confusion, but confusion in the real deep sense of disorientation. You're disoriented. I don't know how to go forward. I don't know how to go back. I'm lost. We know that when Socrates does this, it's mentioned frequently in the Platonic dialogues. Scholars talk about it all the time, about Socrates. And you can even get it in the way the characters who are interacting with Socrates talk about him. They talk about him like he's a stingray. Like you've been stung by a stingray, and you're like, oh, you get all disoriented. Or he's like an enchanter, and he puts a spell on you, and you're all disoriented. That's aporia. And we've talked about how Socrates brings you to this state, this realization of your ignorance, but especially at the perspectival and participatory levels. Okay.
Now, think about almost every significant transformation. Now, when we're talking about transformations, I could go back to Jordan Peterson talking to the chaplain at Liberty University. In Christianity, the transformation we usually look to is conversion. When you look in recovery groups, when you talk about hitting rock bottom, there's definitely an aporic sense to that. If so, I listened to this. I was listening to Aporia, and I'm doing all this listening, and I'm not doing all this reading. And so I'm glad they pulled it up on the screen because okay, well now I know it starts with an A and not an E. So then I searched for it in YouTube land. Let's see. And well, there's a channel called it, but then I found this video, which was quite interesting because this video made the point that the Joker in The Dark Knight, I thought this was a great example. The Joker in The Dark Knight, his main tool is Aporia, and that's really helpful to know because Aporia can be used to many different effects, and what the Joker does again and again is try to use, in fact, the whole channel, this whole channel is named Aporia. Let's see, this is 2.5 million views 5 years ago. What is this? This is mostly interesting little channel. Looks like mostly abandoned a couple of years ago, but I thought it was a great illustration of Aporia because of what the Joker does in The Dark Knight. And that's in a sense his superpower is he brings doubt, disruption, disorder, and I mean that can be used for evil and it can be used for good. I think part of what what at least I hear popularly people getting wrong about psychedelics. Here I brought up psychedelics myself instead of forced to talk about it. That's the way it goes. Is I think people see them as having power to set the proper agenda, and I think in fact their value is in destruction. They're in a sense, I mean, chemotherapy, especially less sophisticated forms of chemotherapy, were all about destroying cells, and the assumption was because cancer was growing faster than normal cellular development, you basically starve out the cancer by stopping all development because normal healthy cells could basically recover and cancer cells grow faster. So it seems to me that the psychedelics have an aporic quality to them. And again, as I used with my examples, Aporia isn't necessarily it can be used for many ends. I mean, the Joker is a master of Aporia. Socrates is a master of Aporia. And I think part of what makes Jesus so powerful is he's a master of Aporia. Those who have recovery programs put their life back together, it's because rock bottom is an aporic condition. And those who at least face rock bottom and use it as Aporia, as, okay, going to make a clean break from my old life and my new life. I mean, that's classic language of Christian conversion. The old is gone, the new has come. Burning off the dead wood, Peterson would like to say. And Aporia has that function. And so here in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You'd say, no, the poor in spirit, that's the Anawim, that's the tradition of of the humble, broken ones who the only help they have left in the world is God. Same with the meek. Those who mourn, the losers. Losers will win. Those who have no resource, no spiritual resource left, poverty of spirit, let's say, no spiritual resource left, they're going to receive everything. The meek inherit the earth. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, you only hunger and thirst because you don't have food and drink, they will be filled. I mean, this is not Old Testament Beatitudes. This is something starkly different, and it's aporic because people listen to it, but it's aporic in a very positive way because on one hand, it breaks the world, and on the other hand, it already begins filling the religious imagination with hope. Hope for the people who seem least likely to receive it.